Hello, my name is Kelly McCain, Head of Health and Healthcare Initiatives at the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is the international organization for public-private cooperation and engages with the foremost political, business, cultural, and other leaders of society to shape global agendas and drive significant impact through public-private collaboration. As society ages, the global community is facing a looming social and economic crisis driven by Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, and is the 7th leading cause of death worldwide, and the only one without a cure. According to the World Health Organization, 10 million new cases of dementia are diagnosed every year, with the number of cases expected to reach 78 million by 2030 and 139 million in 2050. The race is on for scientific developments and research that help us understand, treat, and possibly prevent this disease. But the scientific community faces a significant barrier in the current body of neuroscience research: its diversity. To date, nearly 90% of all research has been conducted on white, Western European individuals, which only accounts for about 10% of the world's population. This leaves experts with an incomplete understanding of diseases of the brain, including Alzheimer's and related dementias. So how can we close these research gaps and speed our abilities to identify new treatments, drive precision medicine, and develop new biomarkers? Today, I am joined by experts from the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, an organization initiated by the World Economic Forum to discuss this challenge and potential solutions to improve, increase, and speed neuroscience research globally. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our panelists today: George Vredenberg, Chairman of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative; Vaibhav Narayan, Executive Vice President of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative; and Chi Udemomo, Lead of Fingers Africa and faculty member at the School of Public Health at Imperial College London. To ground this conversation, let's start with George today. George, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
Can you provide a brief overview of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative and why you so personally are invested in moving this research forward?
Well, the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, as you mentioned, was initiated by the World Economic Forum. They reached out to me sort of to bring the private sector to that conversation. And we started in 2020, and we have now moved around the world to try and address the problem you've addressed. How do we bring the whole world into the solutions, scientific, clinical trials, and health system preparedness needed to solve this disease? My personal involvement is because my late wife's family, a grandmother, a mother, and now a brother, have all been stricken by this disease. So the disease is aimed like a dagger at the heart of my own family. So the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative has 3 programs. One is basically a cohort that we're developing around the world, reflecting the geographic distribution of the population with Alzheimer's and bringing those populations into the research equation. Second is clinical trials, again, initially now the United States, North America, and Europe, but now extending into Kenya and to other parts of the world to try to bring clinical trials to the populations of the world. And finally, health systems. Right now, health systems really are not particularly good at detecting and diagnosing the brain diseases associated with Alzheimer's. And so we're working with them around the world to try and use new technologies, blood-based biomarkers, digital cognitive assessments, in order to diagnose and detect this disease at its very earliest stages.
So Vaibhav, coming to you, how is the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative moving forward precision medicine?
Precision medicine is actually a core to the strategy of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, and I'll tell you why. Alzheimer's disease today is one of the few that is completely incurable, and there is, as of today, not a single disease-modifying treatment on the market. And one of the key reasons for that is that we really don't understand the diversity in the disease. We see the disease as a single disease. We don't understand the subtypes, the patients, the biological diversity. And at DAC, we firmly want to address this. And the way we will address it is by generating cohorts around the world and collecting data from these cohorts around the world in a way that we start to understand what are the different factors that drive this disease, what's the biological heterogeneity of the disease, and what is the heterogeneity in the lived experiences of the disease. And this is incredibly important. I'll give you the example of oncology. Oncology was a largely an intractable disease for many years. The US government, for example, declared a war on cancer, and what really got cancer to the point where it's somewhat solvable now is really the precision medicine understanding of cancer, where we now know that cancer has many different types and it evolves in many different ways, and we are able to tailor our medications to the subtype of the disease and the subtype of the patient. And that's exactly what we want to achieve in Alzheimer's as well. It is not a single disease. It's a very complicated disease in a very complicated organ of the body, and unless we get to a precision approach to addressing Alzheimer's disease, we will not succeed. We will have some successes, but to truly tackle this disease, we need a precision approach, and that is what the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative is looking to do.
Thanks. And Chi, over to you. Given your work with diverse populations, why is the work of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative so important?
That's a good question. I suppose I'll first of all just frame the context of the problem. So there was a recent report by the Global Burden of Disease that actually shows that the incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's disease is going to increase by up to 300%, particularly in areas such as Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA, which is Middle East and North Africa. This is obviously a huge problem and an urgent priority. I'm very encouraged by the work that DAC does, especially pioneering efforts by mapping out the infrastructure and available resources in countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I became very interested when I was first introduced to this work, because in my mind that represented a first step. So I'm very privileged to work with Professor Mia Kivi-Pelto, who leads the Fingers Brain Health Institute, and tell you a little bit about Fingers and why this is important. So Fingers is a landmark study that's one of the first multi-domain lifestyle intervention trials to show any sort of cognitive benefits in people who are at highest risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And it's now expanded to be adopted in, I think, currently 46 countries worldwide. And unfortunately, Africa does not represent one of the continents where the finger model is being adapted and implemented. And that posed a huge problem to me, hence why the work that Davos is doing, that Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative is doing, to really try to understand the etiology of disease in global populations is quite crucial. Because when you look at the literature, even though it's sparse, the available literature does show that the incidence of dementia in Sub-Saharan Africans, for example, is linked to modifiable risk factors. So it can be prevented. So our teams at the Fingers Brain Health Institute and Imperial College London, but also at the Global Brain Health Institute that's across San Francisco, UCSF, and Trinity College Dublin, are working now to develop a Worldwide Fingers Africa project. And we're adopting a two-pronged approach to address health inequity, first in Sub-Saharan, primarily in Sub-Saharan Africa in the first instance. What we're doing at the moment is to address biomarker access inequities, because if you unfortunately look in the literature and try to look at the Alzheimer's disease biomarkers in such populations, I mean, it doesn't even exist. And so we're going to start with that, but we're also going to work with our colleagues at DAC to develop, co-develop with local stakeholders, because that's quite critical and crucial. So local investigators, local experts, into strategies, brain health promotion strategies, through adapting the finger protocol, which includes cognitive stimulation, physical activity, diet and nutritional intervention, but also monitoring of cardiovascular risk. And in this way, we hope to address this health inequity in this particular region.
Great. That's really exciting developments. So Bhavnav, back to you. I know you've been involved in the work of the human genome for a few decades. How has this field evolved, and in a way that may help unlock some of these discoveries in the Alzheimer's and dementia space?
Thanks for the question, Kelly. First of all, Alzheimer's has a strong genetic component, and genomics has a huge role to play in understanding the disease and solving it. The challenge, of course, has been that so far, most of the genetic and genomic data in Alzheimer's, more than 90% of it, has been generated from a very small set of the population, which is not representative of the world. When I participated in the Human Genome Project, it took us almost a decade and more than $1 billion to sequence a single reference genome. I think one of the biggest advances that has happened is just how faster the sequencing has become and how much less expensive it has become. A few years ago, it would cost you $10,000 to sequence a genome. And now, the latest news is that you could sequence a genome for about $200. And you could sequence this from saliva. Now, there's technology that we can get reliable whole genome sequencing just from saliva samples. So this really sets the stage, I think, of truly democratizing genomic information in Alzheimer's disease. Like George mentioned, we are developing global cohorts in Alzheimer's. Our goal is to collect genetic and genomic data from people across the world and really understand Alzheimer's as a function of race, ethnicity, and geographies. And so this, I think, is one of the key advances, quite frankly, just the speed and cost of genomic sequencing. But it's not just that, of course. It's not just the fact that you can generate genetic sequencing and genomic sequencing. What matters is what are the outcomes that you can relate it to. Early on in genetic and genomic studies, the most you did was you took some people who were normal, some people who had the disease, you sequenced both of them and just tried to look at gross differences. Now we are able to correlate or connect genetic information to much more useful outcomes. So for example, we will have longitudinally followed cohorts in our cohorts program, and we will sequence them. So we will not just relate the genetic information to do you have the disease or not. We will relate the genetic information to how fast you progress in this disease. What are your real-world outcomes? So this will essentially give us predictors of disease progression. As an example, we will sequence people who are participating in clinical trials, people who are taking different medications. We will find out what type of Alzheimer's patient, we'll find the genetic signature of what type of Alzheimer's patient actually responds to drugs, or they do not respond to drugs. So basically, genomic information will now drive predictive medicine and precision medicine, and not just tell you about some high-level theoretical risk. The other, of course, explosion that has happened is in data science and analytics, which also combines very nicely with the genomic revolution. And now we are able to get at much more complex understanding of the disease because we can analyze these data. I'll give you an example. We can do single-cell sequencing, deep sequencing of neuronal cells, immune cells, which are involved in Alzheimer's disease. And we can now, through advanced analytics, find out complex signatures of genes that might be driving this disease. And what this will essentially enable is finding new targets, new mechanisms that are associated with the disease. I mentioned earlier that Alzheimer's is a heterogeneous disease, and we need to find multiple mechanistic pathways to hit this disease. And this kind of complex data analysis of complex genetic information will allow that. So I think there are many reasons to be optimistic about how advances in the genomics, the kind of outcomes we collect, and the kind of analytics that we can do will drive progress in this disease.
And Chi, look over to you.
Yeah.
With all of these advancements, and as we gain a greater understanding of the disease, there's also a huge emergence of tools for detection, diagnostics, and treatment. Are these well suited for global use?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very exciting time for neuroscience and dementia research. You'll probably be aware of the fact that we now have the capacity to detect abnormal brain proteins using peripheral markers, for example, blood-derived fluids like plasma and serum, to actually show us what's going on in the brain. So, I mean, that's so exciting. I was a skeptic at first when I first started my journey in dementia research about using blood, but now I'm going even beyond blood to say I think saliva might even be the next tool. But over to your question. So it's a really exciting time. And I think also to point out that it's occurring simultaneously with encouraging reports that we're getting from disease-modifying therapies that may actually be effective in clearing the brain of these abnormal brain proteins. I mean, it's phenomenal time. We're all very excited. And, but I have to come back to that question of whether these tools are, will have optimal utility across global populations. And when we talk about global populations, we have to look economically as well into high versus low resource settings. So if you think about the sort of gold standard tools for biomarker discovery, but also detection of disease and treatment, or even monitoring the effectiveness of treatment. Most of the tools that we've used are cerebrospinal fluid via lumbar puncture, or an MRI scans, but even PET scans, which are positron emission tomography to look at like the levels of the biomarkers. These have really been developed in high-income countries. They are extremely expensive. And so the advances in the blood-based biomarkers might allow for cost-effective utility in more diverse populations, but also in low-resource settings. But at this present stage, these blood biomarkers, because you collect the blood and then you analyze it, the analysis of the biomarkers are still quite expensive. And this economic divide will pose a huge problem in its implementation in lower resource settings. So I still think the field needs to look towards more cost-effective biomarkers, and we are working in this space to look into that, for example, with saliva fluids, but also even like the gut microbiome. So keep these fingers crossed to see if we can actually do this.
That's really exciting to hear, and it leads really perfectly, and I think a discussion that we could have with the full panel, which is we've been seeing quite a bit that we're now entering into what is called the golden age of neuroscience.
Yes.
Panel, do you believe this is true? And do we have reasons to be optimistic? I'll start with you, George.
Well, as you've just heard, the tools by which we do the analysis here are coming down in cost and permitting, therefore, potentially global scale in terms of doing research. That's exciting. I think we're at the beginning of the beginning, however, because this brain thing up here is pretty complicated, and putting things into it and not getting side effects that are pretty bad is a challenge. So the tools are coming down in cost, they're going up in sophistication, the global scale is possible, but what's, I think, very exciting is the ability to include low resource settings in all of this research and get at what Vaibhav was talking about, which is how do you understand the diversity of the disease and the diversity of approaches to attack it. So I think it's an exciting time, but we've heard about the golden age of neuroscience for 20 or 30 years. So I am going to say, yes, we're at yet another golden age of neuroscience because of the tool development, sophistication of tools, and the global scale at which we can apply them and understand the heterogeneity of the disease in heterogeneous populations around the world.
Okay, Bob, over to you.
I agree with George that we have been talking about the golden age of neuroscience for 20 and 30 years, but I have reasons to believe that we may be now reaching a bit of a tipping point. And the reason for that is both on what I would say the supply side and the demand side. The demand side, I think people are finally beginning to realize that there is no health without brain health. Many things have sort of spurred this. The brain is not just about neurological diseases, it's about mental health as well. There has been an increasing awareness around mental health and its impact on society. As societies age, people have realized that keeping your brain healthy, keeping your cognition healthy is a very important part of not just an individual's health, but as a way of ensuring good societal output. As economies go towards more knowledge-based economies, the collective cognitive capital of the society is what essentially gives you the competitive edge. So I think there are many things happening on the demand side that are now creating more focus on brain health in general and the need to preserve cognitive capital. So that's good. There's anything in increasing awareness. And on the supply side, I think that the tools are finally getting there. Brain science is moving away from sort of descriptive, subjective endpoints to more quantitative measures. There have been fantastic advances in genomics, genetics that we just talked about. There are terrific advances in neuroimaging, our ability to really understand the structure and function of the brain, even non-invasively. Digital health, which has taken off recently in a very accelerated way, is ideally suited for the brain diseases. Brain is both a terrific transmitter and a terrific receiver, and there are many ways to sort of assess its status digitally as well. So I think there is a confluence of on both the supply side and the demand side, which makes me believe that we may be at the right spot. I do agree with Josh that we are still closer to the beginning than the end, but I think if we take a more sort of inclusive approach to solving brain health, we can probably do it.
However, one of the biggest challenges that we've identified in the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative is the global coordination piece. George, what policies are needed to make progress at speed?
I think we have to realize the size of the problem around the world, with 50 million families today, 150 million in the next couple of decades, that consequence of the aging of the populations is creating massive suffering of families, not just individuals, but families, and massive economic costs. And as the percentage of the population in the working class, as opposed to the retired class, becomes smaller and smaller, we need greater productivity. So the notion that this is simply a science problem is wrong. This is a societal problem of greater magnitude. And so what that means is that we need everybody on deck. No one company can solve this problem. No one sector can solve this problem. No academic researcher can solve this problem. The academic sector cannot solve the problem. Governments alone cannot solve the problem. But each of us has to bring our respective skills together to finance the science, to pursue the science, and with business to pursue the solutions, and quite frankly, with patients to make sure that all of this is focused on getting better therapeutics and better risk reduction interventions to people, because the people are suffering. So that requires coordination across all the sectors and deep patient advocacy around the world.
So Bob, let's fast forward to 2030. What has the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative delivered?
Well, first of all, I think, George, we have hopefully addressed many of the challenges that you just outlined. I think by 2030, I would hope that we have truly democratized Alzheimer's research and innovation. We have brought new people from new parts of the world who were previously not participating in the solving of this disease. And this is going to be important because, like we talked about earlier, the solution has to come from data and tools that truly represent the people who are actually suffering from this disease. I really hope in 2030 we have essentially a global living laboratory, a learning engine for Alzheimer's disease that is contributing to solving this particular disease. By 2030, I'm hopeful that we will also have some therapeutics on the market, some disease-modifying therapies on the market. If DAC is successful in its goals, we believe that we would have demonstrated that it is possible to identify the patients, the right patients at the right time for these therapies using scalable and globally validated tools, whether they are blood-based biomarkers or whether they are digital cognitive assessment tools. We really want to understand how do you find patients not just in North America and Western Europe, but how do we find the right patients for these therapies around the entire world. By 2030, our hope is that we will also have demonstrated, at least in some closed-loop community settings, that you can, using technology-based assessments, identify people who are at high risk for Alzheimer's, dementia, and cognitive decline, and funnel them into evidence-based risk reduction programs improving outcomes non-pharmacologically. And this will reach people in a preemptive way in parts of the world where some of these therapies may not yet be affordable. So we believe that by 2030, we would definitely have demonstrated that this is possible in multiple parts of the world. I think one of the challenges that we at DAC have, and that I think George was just mentioning even last evening, is that yes, you can demonstrate it in certain parts of the world, in certain closed-loop systems, but how will it sustain itself? I don't know if by 2030 we would have created a sustainable solution, but I hope that by 2030 we have learned what does it take to then sustain these kinds of risk reduction programs or pharmacological interventions in a way that you can replicate across multiple geographies, multiple healthcare systems, and multiple community settings. I think we will have hopefully some very powerful learnings, at least in that particular space. I think ultimately, I believe that we would have created an environment in which more diagnostics, more non-pharmacological interventions, more pharmacological interventions can go to more people because we have involved more people in generating these solutions, and we have a better ecosystem of ideas. I will close by also saying that one of our goals also is to continue to drive diversity in clinical trials for the next generation of drugs. By 2030, there will still be a next generation of drugs that are being developed, and we hope that because of the work that we are doing globally across healthcare systems and across the different cohorts that we are developing, that when those next generation of trials have been recruited in 2030, we are actually recruiting patients from trial-ready cohorts around the world. And those clinical trials, represent the global diversity of the world, thus leading to even better medications in drugs that will then be launched in 2035 or 2040. So I think it's an optimistic point of view. It's daunting, but it can be achieved.
I'm going to jump in and say by 2030, I would like to see an Alzheimer's vaccine on the market. There are now 6 Alzheimer's vaccines in clinical development. And with the right set of capital investment and the combination that we created for COVID among research institutions and the regulatory agencies and payers, I think we can get to a point where we're going to have a vaccine on the market. So I'm even more optimistic than Vaibhav.
And I'll jump in and say that if we have a vaccine on the market, which I truly hope we have by 2030, we will have a funnel and engine to really identify who are the right people for this vaccine, because now you're talking about primary and secondary prevention. And so we do think that large-scale characterization of brain health, cognitive decline, early detection, risk stratification, all this will lead into successful deployment of novel modalities like the vaccine.
And to precede that, we really need to encourage diversity in our understanding of the etiology of the disease, but also biomarker risk profiles across diverse populations.
Great, and Chi, that actually leads me to a really good point, and I will ask you first. So we've now projected out to 2030.
Yeah.
But we also need to think short term. What is the most important next step to take?
You're right. I think that George and Vaibhav have really described quite nicely sort of like the long-term goals, but also our long-term hopes and even strategies by which these are going to hopefully take place. But of course, when looking to the short term, because of when you think about the need for diversity in neuroscience, but also dementia research being an urgent priority, then of course we need some goals in the immediate term. And I do think that sort of setting up a framework, for instance, for conducting research, for understanding what infrastructure are available, for thinking about the economic implications, but also operational and policy implications as well, for doing this sort of research in low resource settings, but also across diverse populations in high resource settings is really important. And I'll give you an example. So if you go to Africa, for example, there are attitudes towards dementia that may be quite unfamiliar to people from a Western society. So, for instance, people being thought to have a mental health issue, or even like be called a witch, or something like so. So there are negative attitudes already towards diagnosing Alzheimer's, and we really need to consider those aspects. So short term for me is we need a framework for conducting research in low resource settings, but across diverse populations in high resource settings that will take all of these considerations into account. And this could set a roadmap then to really empower, along with local stakeholders across global populations, I suppose, on how we can actually bring, first of all, identify disease, but then also implement therapies, including vaccines, worldwide. So I do think that first step of setting up that, describing that framework for conducting research is crucial. We're actually partnering, so our group with the Worldwide Fingers Project is quite key, I think, because we're partnering, because one person can't do it all. I don't think one person or one group or one organization can solve this issue. So there needs to be collaborative efforts. So an example is our multinational collaboration to promote brain health, when we're partnering with DAC, with Alzheimer's Association, with the Global Brain Health Institute to do this. An example of a successful initiative, so it shows me that it can be done, is the Red Lat project that's led by Dr. Agustin Ibanez in Latin America. So it is very possible to really map out, but bring crucial stakeholders that will also provide funding, but also a transfer of knowledge between people from different settings, both high and low resource, to really try to address brain health inequity. So it is quite possible. So collaboration is key.
And for the other panelists, any other immediate short-term steps that we should take or consider?
I think it's important for governments to get engaged. And I think the rest of the world should be investing in Alzheimer's research. Vaibhav mentioned earlier the fact that we declared war on cancer in 1971. It's 50 years later. The sustained investment over time with increasing amounts every year has led to an enormous set of progress against cancer. We're not yet seeing that kind of government commitment around the world to investment in Alzheimer's research. So getting governments involved, G7, G20, all governments, in figuring out how to develop a research plan that's sustainable, that is growing, because it takes a long time for research to turn into products, to turn into availability to patients. So we need patience and urgency at the same time with respect to government involvement.
Okay, Rob, the last word.
Yep, and I would say that, George just sort of really highlighted the urgency, and I think over the past 20 minutes or so, we have laid out a pretty strong vision. For me, I think the short term has to be about the execution, right? And execution almost always involves sometimes somewhat more boring things, but we have to be able to establish some of the collaborations and the agreements that we talked about with entities around the world. We have to be able to collect the data. We have to be able to collect the biosamples. We have to be able to collect the digital assessments that we are talking about. We have to address sort of the local laws and regulations and the data governance issues that are involved in bringing together these data in the way that we want to bring it together. We have some terrific partners like the Alzheimer's Data and Disease Initiative that we'll be working with to be able to do that. So we basically want to create some very clear, demonstrable successes, some very clear, I don't want to use the word pilot because that has wrong connotations, but we want to be able to create and execute on certain programs that will clearly demonstrate the efficacy and the value of the approach that we talked about, which is creating a living and learning engine that truly reflects the diversity of the people who live with this disease.
And George, reflecting back on the last several minutes of conversation, what's next for DAC?
DAC has to engage governments. We've got business involved, we've got the pharmaceutical industry involved, we have the biotech industry involved, we have foundations involved, we have patients involved. We do need to engage governments. So the very next step is potentially a G7 meeting, which will occur next year. So that is our immediate next step. There's no question that we need to do precisely what Vaibhav said. We have to execute on some things to demonstrate that the infrastructure that we're creating actually works to produce a materially faster or better and more responsive set of therapeutics for the world. So that's a challenge. We're doing it, steady progress, but it's a big infrastructure build. But then the government's going to have to get involved with us to do this.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists today, and thank you for all of the expert insights on how to make neuroscience research more diverse and some pathways that we can take to unlock the cure to Alzheimer's disease. The World Economic Forum, in partnership with the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, is committed to uniting leading organizations worldwide to build this innovative ecosystem that we've just discussed that will accelerate breakthroughs, develop and scale promising solutions, and equip every healthcare system to end Alzheimer's disease everywhere. To learn more about this initiative or to get involved, please visit the website at www.davosalzheimerscollaborative.org, and we thank you for your participation today.